Dr. Hoeller is Associate Professor of Comparative Religion at the College of Oriental Studies in Los Angeles, California. A scholar of both Gnosticism and Jungian psychology, he is also a longtime student of the writings of Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement. He is interviewed by Jo Pym, a national worker for the Theosophical Society in America. Today's program explores the value of seeing Theosophy as myth.
Stephan, in recent years there's been a great deal of popular interest in the subject of mythology and myth, possibly due to the work of Joseph Campbell. Can you tell me what, in your opinion, is the relationship of the Theosophical tradition to myth and mythology?
The Theosophical tradition has an intimate connection since its the inception of its modern manifestation in any event through H.P. Blavatsky with myth. H.P. Blavatsky was a very atypical person, as most people know, and she also had attitudes toward myth that were quite different. She did not believe, as so many people in the 19th century did, and perhaps many people still do because of certain vernacular connotations being attached to the word myth, that a myth is an untruth. Right. Or that a myth is a lie, as it were. But rather she held that from archaic times onward, the deepest truths of life were very frequently communicated in the form of myth. In fact, if I am able to get hold of one of her quotations here on the subject, I might mention it. She wrote, "Myth was the favorite and universal method of teaching in archaic times." And she also wrote, "Fairy tales do not exclusively belong to nurseries. All mankind, except those few who in all ages have truly comprehended their hidden meaning, have listened to such tales in one shape or other, and after transforming them into sacred symbols, called the product religion." These are only a very few of the many quotations that one may adduce from HPB. So HPB had a very interesting and very positive view of myth. She felt it was a very valuable medium for the communication of deeper, or what might be called theosophic truths. And so I feel that we also ought to follow in her footsteps, and with the, especially with the increased emphasis on myth now, to address ourselves to an exploration of the mythic dimensions of our theosophy.
Okay. Before we go into that, and you have a model that we'll kind of explore and follow today, say that myth is a metaphor for the transcendent. Is that what you're saying, the transcendent experience? I believe that was a definition you used somewhere.
Yes, I used it, and it is one that Joseph Campbell used, so many people today understand it, that a myth is a metaphor that is open to transcendence.
Okay,
yes.
There we go. Yeah. And in a sense, because that experience is so deep, we can't use sort of ordinary language, and we need a deeper or mythic language to express it?
Yes, every kind of experience, every level of experience requires its own medium to be communicated. And as certainly intellectual experiences, intellectual truths require the verbiage of the language, the declarative, exhortative method. However, certain deeper, more intuitively, mystically toned experiences will not respond to that kind of communication. That is why a lot of great mystics, both in the East and in the West, communicated their insights in myth, and the myth was very often expressed in poetry. Right. Homer, the Puranas, such as the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, the part of the Mahabharata, and the great Christian mystics as well, St. John of the Cross, many others. It requires a different, this kind of experience requires a different way of communication.
Okay. So the model that you've sort of written out and of which you have a chart that we're going to sort of follow today is one where you have contrasted what you call the consensus reality or the traditional reality and the alternative reality approach. And myth is very central to the second, right?
Yes, myth is very central to the alternative reality approach. That is a term, by the way, which alternative reality tradition, which I think was primarily coined by our fellow theosophist, Professor Robert Elwood, in some of his works on this subject. And the model that we are dealing with starts with an experience. First we have an experience, and now the consensus reality approach, then, such as the great religions, popular religions, and so forth, tend to turn that in fairly short order into a document of sacred scripture, and from there they turn it into belief and rules, commandments, maxims of behavior. Well, the alternative reality approach, which is really the esoteric approach, as we call it in a lot of our literature, turns the experience directly into myth, and then later the myth is usually expressed or acted out in ritual or sacrament, and from there it moves toward the point of internalization or assimilation on the part of the individual, which in turn usually enables the mind to come back to the primal experience once more.
Okay.
And that is the completion of the circle from experience back to experience again. And that's where the myth plays the great role, because that is the second step, the first step after experience. That is.
So within the theosophical tradition, if we take a book like The Secret Doctrine or something like that, we could follow either model, really. We could take the Secret Doctrine and hold it as a set of beliefs and dogmas and try to read it and memorize it, or we can use it as a myth in your point of view and make more experience and work with it that way. Is that right?
Yes, I think very few of us realize, or at least articulate very often, that to each one of us, our theosophy starts with experience.
Right.
We have all come to this curious and delightful and offbeat endeavor of theosophy, really by way of our experience, whatever kind. And really, I think one of the great things about our theosophical movement is the very fact that different people have come along and are still coming along, and they can experience theosophy in their own way, in a different way, and consequently also will give it a somewhat different expression. That is why I'm not really a back to Blavatsky theosophist, because we have to have our own experience rather than Blavatsky's or anyone else's.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take the diagram that you've shown us and go through it step by step and sort of relate it to various aspects of the theosophical tradition. What would you think are some of the possibly basic or initial theosophical experiences people might have had?
Of course, the experiences would be very varied and would depend on the very largely on the individual. But some people will experience some aspect of the theosophical myth with greater intensity than others. Some perhaps feel that they have memories and experiences relating to past lives, so to them the reincarnation myth will become particularly relevant. And others may have different experiences of that sort.
Like maybe you've had a touch of what they would see as the first principle or the transcendent unity. Maybe that would be an experience
absolutely.
That
The one life, the unity of life as a great all-embracing oneness, which again it has to be felt.
Right, you can read about it all day and it doesn't do you any good.
It's not an intellectual concept. And Dr. Besant's wonderful invocation of hidden life, I mean that is certainly not a conceptual statement. It's a statement of intensely felt experience. So there may be a whole number of experiences of that sort. And then the question arises, well now, what is the next step after that? And that is really where the myth comes in.
Okay.
So that, let's say, starting with the hidden life or the one life. When we contemplate HPB's secret doctrine, practically the whole secret doctrine is really the myth of the movements and the developments, the transformations, the varieties of that life. Through every aspect of that depicted evolutionary journey, there is what calls to us constantly is that changing, evolving, developing hidden life, which we are, but which also all other beings and other things are. So this is the great myth of the divine spark that has come forth and is traveling and developing into its own fullness in order to return to its original wholeness once again.
Yeah, so that's probably the sort of base or fundamental underlying myth. And then there's a lot of ways that it's been experienced, like you said, someone else might have experienced it in another part. And I'd like you to comment on some of these.
Well, let's see.
Maybe the chakra system?
Yes. Well, of course, the chakra system, as so many other systems of that sort, is not the exclusive property of Theosophy, and neither are the others really. It's something that comes from certain aspects of Hinduism, from the Tantras primarily, and so forth. But again, I think it's probably a good example because there is a way of looking at the chakra system in a kind of factual manner, that these are some sort of psychophysiological centers, localizations in the organism, and there is a particular energy that moves up these in a kind of very quasi-scientific way. And I think that is probably still the way in which a great many people view it. But it can also be viewed as a myth. And in fact, it is expressed as such a myth in a lot of the Indian sources. A lot of people here don't know that Kundalini is really a woman, for instance, not just a snake.
A female snake.
Female snake.
Right.
It's a goddess who is down in the earth, and from there, through the 7 stages, you might say, of transformational development or awareness, rises to the top of the tree or the top of the world, where she meets Shiva, her divine consort, and is reunited with him again. And then the 7 chakras, which are at least the early first 5 are related to the elements of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, are stages of developments, and the movement of the Kundalini depicts these transformational stages. That is when it is viewed as a myth rather than as a fact.
Right, because if you look at it in a very literal sense, there are people who talk about one center being alive and the other one's dead, essentially, like activated one at a time, whereas even if you take it as well, in a different theosophical sense, they're all there at all times, that they're a part of us. And we were talking earlier about the fact that it's our awareness that it's expanding. It's not that something is moving in a snake-like fashion, but it's our awareness that's changing from time to time.
Yes, and I think even the clairvoyant investigators whose books we have on these subjects, so the late Mr. Hodgson and others, will want to indicate that when it is consciousness that is rising, and then these centers are illuminated and enlivened and enlarged, not as if they were dead, and then a snake comes up and they are alive now. So it is really a myth of the rise of consciousness. And when we can envision that and meditate upon that, then without wanting to raise, quote, Kundalini physically by any exercises, we can profit by this myth.
Right. In the same kind of way, you could look at the sort of theosophical notion of higher self and lower self as mythical concepts. Some people look at them as very literal, like here you are and there it is, or something like that, and as opposed to what, mythic dimensions of yourself or different dimensions?
Yes, and there are a large number of beautiful myths all over the world which deal with the relationship of the higher and the lower self quite plainly. Amor and Psyche, or Cupid and Psyche, which is a famous Greek myth depicting the two, taken from Apuleius very largely, the one that we deal with, and also Radha and Krishna. And
you were saying the Gnostic myth of the twin angel.
And the Gnostic myth of the Valentinian Gnostic myth of the twin angel. And these are all mythic expressions of the let's say the psychological, the spiritual fact that there is a higher counterpart of ourselves and our personality, and that these two are only in a very tenuous connection. They have a tenuous connection with each other until they begin to relate to each other and ultimately unite, which is the purpose of all yoga union, mystical union in Christianity and so forth.
In some ways, if we study those myths, we may get a deeper understanding or a deeper experience or view of what it means than if we just try to make it on a chart. Higher self, lower self, planes of nature, that kind of stuff.
Oh yes, because this, the insightful contemplation, I feel, of the myth stirs up certain forces within ourselves. It relates to our feelings, it stirs our imagination, it appeals to a much more complete selfhood within us than the intellectual approach of charts and words.
So if I'm going to be sort of traditionally theosophical, I can say the myth touches the intuition, in a sense, or moves us into the deepest parts of ourselves. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of the myths that are maybe more controversial and not often talked about. We were laughing earlier about the whole notion of the separation of the sexes as a myth. That in the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky says that at one period of time there was only one sex, then it differentiated into two, and it will go back to one.
Yes.
Do you see that as a mythic, or rather than a factual or an evolutionary statement, or both?
Oh yes,
or what?
I would see it primarily as a mythic statement, and here we may need to also mention that an additional definition of the myth might be, or as kind of a touchstone as to whether we are dealing with a real myth or not. The myth always has a fairly direct contemporary applicability to ourselves.
Okay.
Just like higher self, lower self. I mean, Amor and Psyche were not out there somewhere carrying on in Greece, but they exist within us and are carrying on right here. And so do Radha and Krishna and the others. And so similarly here, I would say the immediate mythic meaning of HPB's statement about the originally androgynous, proto-humanity, and then the division of the sexes, the splitting apart of the male and the female later on, and their present division, and the ultimate possibility of their union, really has to do with the polarities within ourselves. And that we are also sort of divided, as modern psychology says. In the man the animus predominates, in the woman the anima predominates, but the other one is in the background. And eventually they need to come together in a kind of psychological androgynousness. Now this is not to say that possibly at some level, even physically, this metaphor may be true in some remote history, but I don't feel that that is as important as the contemporary mythic understanding. And HPB herself, in one of the late volumes, probably 13th volume of her collected writings, shortly before her death, when commenting on the Gnostic book Pistis Sophia, mentioned both of these interpretations of the androgynousness, and she mentioned that it also pertains to the inner union of ourselves becoming male and female inside of ourselves psychologically. She didn't use that term. So she was well aware of these mythic factors, and we are not really corrupting her teachings, I think, if we apply them.
Right. Would you say the same thing in terms of Lemuria, Atlantis, those kinds of things that they may be factually true, but the most important truth for us is how we make them real inside?
Very much so. I think that Atlantis, for instance, is really what in Jungian psychology we would call an archetype. It is the archetype of the sunken land, the sunken consciousness that has gone underneath has become submerged underneath the waves of forgetfulness and unconsciousness, that great, magnificent, ancient glory that we once were, but which is now submerged and which needs to rise, needs to be rediscovered. And as far as I'm aware, others may hold differently, but as far as I'm aware, the Atlantis theory has been with us now for quite a long time, and no real physical evidence of it has been found yet. There may be, maybe there may be tomorrow, maybe never. But I know that the evidence for the mythic understanding is available to us right now, because there's an Atlantis inside of us and we can find it.
Right.
It's actually far less trouble to look for it there than to go out
in an expedition somewhere.
mount an expedition into the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, what we're really talking about is what in the Mahatma letters, I think they talk about is the law of analogy. It's whatever is inside is outside, or as above, below in the Hermetic tradition. So those were guidelines to looking at this stuff in this way as an important...
And of course the application of that in practical spiritual terms would be that all things outside remind us of the task and the opportunities that exist inside.
So we've talked about why myth, and even looking at theosophical sort of standards, may be useful to look at as myth. The third part on your chart is ritual, and that's a relatively controversial point oftentimes in the society.
Oh yes, oh
Can
yes.
you address yourself to that as what happens next after we've sort of seen these things as myth?
Well, ritual has always stood to myth in sort of the same relationship as, let us say, a theatrical performance stands to a play. You can read a play of Shakespeare, and it's certainly a very nice reading. But it's an even more intense experience to see the drama performed, or perhaps to participate in the performance of the drama. And real ritual is really of that order. Now, the kind of 19th century, early 20th century thinking that often attached itself to theosophy, of course, often made ritual synonymous with the kind of dead, repetitious, purely traditional activities that went on in churches and various places, which are like a body from which the soul has fled, and therefore, there was a very derogatory attitude toward that. Although, of course, in a certain theosophical period, there has
many new rituals were created.
There has arisen an interest in masonry and some certain church rituals from an esoteric point of view. And so we have to realize, however, that even the best of rituals are an example, you might say, a dramatic example in many ways of what we ought to do in terms of our own inner ritual with ourselves. If we have, for instance, the greatest ritual of Christendom, the Holy Eucharist, wherein the bread and the wine are transformed mystically into the body and blood of Christ by the celebrating priest, and so forth. Well, this is a dramatic example of how the, let's say, the higher and lower, maybe the personal and transpersonal substances within ourselves can be transformed. And by participating in that alchemy in a church ceremony, we are in a way reminded of our own priesthood and our own alchemical task within ourselves. And that is the real value of these matters.
For you, say, because you are a priest in the Gnostic Church, when you're celebrating the Mass, you're not just thinking it through, you're trying to re-experience that meaning in the deepest sense, and that's the part that brings it alive, as opposed to just following a form because it says turn left here, throw one.
They are really the repetitions of a divine act, and have been conceived as such by some of the most archaic primitive peoples like the Australian Aboriginals and others. They also say in certain of their rituals, as the gods have done, so we do now, and by doing this we are united with the gods. It's something that has to be felt rather than intellectually comprehended, because then we could just read the book.
Okay, and the other point that we have talked about at other times is that we're not just always talking about those formalized rituals. I think you said that even for those of us who don't maybe react to ritual in a form, our whole lives in a sense are a ritual. We create rituals out of our daily experience.
Absolutely, but of course we need to remember that, as I mentioned before, we need examples.
Sure.
This is teaching by example, and this then it has been said that the participation in the sacraments leads to the sacramental life, where life itself becomes a sacrament. But many people reason, well, why should the Sunday be the Lord's Day or Saturday? Every day is the Lord's Day. Well, this is true, but one has to begin somewhere.
Right.
So we set aside sacred time, sacred space, sacred action, and from there it hopefully radiates out into the individual's life so that eventually everything becomes sacred.
And are you suggesting then that in our lives we look for places to bring in this ritual quality, or do you think that the...
Oh yes, I think that whenever we express meaningfully the inner content of our own myth, we are in fact engaged in a ritual and sacramental act. But that doesn't mean that that's the only kind. There are other kinds too.
We may go and talk some more about it, because it goes right into that next area I've heard you say yesterday, in fact, that there's no point in just having the experience. I mean, it's a good thing, but you want to internalize it in some way, to make it real, to make it an ongoing process in your life. And that's that fourth part of your diagram. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Another set of terms might be, which are perhaps also helpful, that experience needs to be amplified and then assimilated. So we might say that the myth, and maybe even more the dramatic reenactment of the myth in ritual, is the amplification of experience. Now we know a lot about amplification nowadays because we constantly hear this terribly amplified music coming from cars and everything else. It's quite dreadful in many cases. But it means making something louder, making something more dramatic. And then when the amplification has occurred, there needs to be an assimilation. This now has to be internalized and truly amalgamated with our consciousness before we are ready for something else. And that is perhaps where the considerable concern of so many theosophists with meditation comes in, because that assimilation is not very easy when we are distracted. When we don't know how to concentrate, when we are sort of eaten up by the forces of the external world, and to learn how to quiet ourselves, to learn how to connect ourselves with the deeper psyche, as the psychologist would put it, and all these meditative exercises can be very helpful for the assimilation of experience. Right. And however, I would like to say this, that I don't feel that the only valid meditation is sort of on the Eastern model, what in psychology we call introspective meditation. But that maybe we need to expand the meaning of the term meditation a little and look into various other modalities, no doubt cautiously and insightfully, because there's a lot of nonsense passes for meditation too, especially these days, and we'll end up, I don't know, swallowing crystals or whatever in a meditative fashion.
Well, you were saying things like in your book, the Tarot, Kabbalah, those are sort of meditative practices that help in this assimilation process?
Yes, there are practices which are, let's say, the equivalents of Eastern forms of meditation, which have existed in the West for a long time. The so-called Kabbalistic path work is one that can be combined with the tarot, and there are others. And we need to remember that many of these can be valid ways of deepening the inner life and of contributing to the assimilation of greater experience.
But you brought another chart with you, which is called, I think, the 3 stages of ceremonial magic, or something like that. Has little squares and triangles.
Well, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a little way of looking at that relationship of the lower and the higher self, which is found really in many different sources, and the main one, the main diagram here probably comes from Hermetic sources, which have to do with magic to some extent, and there the expression became common of what was called the Holy Guardian Angel. This is really the overshadowing higher self, like the twin angel in the Gnostic system and so forth. And so there are the 3 stages. The square on the diagram symbolizes the lesser or lower self, the lower quaternary, as we call it in Theosophy.
Right.
Earth, water, fire, and air, and so forth. The ego in psychology. And then the triangle would symbolize the higher self. So the first stage is called the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel. Here the lesser self perceives that there is a greater. Very important. If you don't perceive it, nothing is going to happen, because we have been ignoring it all this time. And then the second one, we see a certain little connection between the square and the triangle. And this is often called the conversation of or with the Holy Guardian Angel. Now a personal relationship develops.
That might be in the 4th stage then, when you're trying to internalize, you're making this kind of relationship. Yes,
you are now conversing. This is what perhaps somewhat like Martin Buber's I and Thou, God, the relationship to God. And then there is yet a 4th stage when we see the square and the triangle having combined. The triangle has come to rest upon the square. That is the union. Now even the I and Thou has ceased, and the two have been welded into one. This is incidentally also very similar to, analogous to 3 of the major phases of union in the classical Christian mysticism. The first one is called the way of cleansing, via purgativa. The second one, the last one, is called the via unitiva, the union, and in between is the way of illumination, when the light begins to sort of flash back and forth between the higher and the lower. These are again ways of envisioning that mythic process whereby these two come together.
And that's the sort of the return back to the experience, is that right?
Yes, the assimilation, because in the alternative tradition we feel that once the one experience has been properly assimilated, this sort of generates enough psychic energy, we might say, in the person that now they are catapulted up, as it were, now that last little part on the circle of our diagram, up to the top to experience again. So that life doesn't have to be just one mystical experience and then you kind of live off of that the rest of your life like a bank account, but there can be many, and they always bring a new keynote, a new energy, a new enlivening for one's condition.
You know, we didn't talk about art as a part of that internalization process, and you have often thought the arts, well, you mentioned drama and all of that, but you think of that as an important part in that internalization process.
Oh yes, art of course is an aspect of this, and in many ways this is really a large subject. In many ways art is both the creation of a myth and the ritualization of a myth itself, because that creative process brings the experience into outer manifestation. So the finished product of a creative art, whatever it happens to be, painting, sculpture, poem, or composition, or whatever, is really like the ritual product at the end. And here I think that we also need to somewhat evaluate our position. You know, I hope I'm not doing anybody any injustice, but somehow, as far as I'm able to see, Theosophy has inspired some very great artists, particularly in the modern movement in the early 1900s and so forth. But artists never seemingly worked too well within the Theosophical movement.
Maybe because we go back into the more conventional modality, do you think?
Well, I think that we tend to put intellectual projections on our artists. We say art is to create beauty. Whose definition of beauty? What is beauty? You know, the beauty as an intellectual concept, like truth as an intellectual concept. And when we do that, we limit the artist thereby. Art is not the creation of beauty by anyone's definition. Art is the creation of an inner reality, which has its own beauty, no doubt.
So in a sense, it's a different form just of myth. It's a pictorial form of myth, perhaps.
I am not a great admirer of non-objective abstract art and things of that sort, but I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that art does not always create harmony and beauty, but it also can create reality in a manner which may appear somewhat disharmonious to us, but which still serves a creative purpose.
Which is a part of that process of going around and around that circle.
Yes.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions to ask you before we stop, but I wonder if there's anything more you want to say about that circular process. It sounds like we're talking about attitudes, and we're talking about openness and awareness, and continuing a process and not getting stuck somewhere along the way.
It is really, you might say, it is leading life in an alive manner. By replenishing the supply of spiritual and psychic energy of the individual psyche by way of repeated experiences of transcendence.
So the whole process that you're talking about reminds me again of what Blavatsky said about truth in the Bowen article, that in the process of our understanding truth always changing. I think she said the dangerous place is when we're afraid to let go of the way we've looked at it before, and we fall back instead of going on and letting a new picture emerge, or facing that period of time where we don't know what's going on.
Yes, there are in-between phases, it would seem, between what we have been and what we shall become. And these are gray areas which are very stressful and very scary, because we are neither here nor there, and we always like to be somewhere.
Right, and know where it is.
And know where it is. And perhaps the entire Theosophical movement is somewhat in such a gray area now. We are no longer really what we have been 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, and yet the new picture, the new orientation hasn't quite emerged yet. But it's very important for us to find our own theosophic myth within ourselves, and then the entire movement being composed of us will also move along in a desirable direction, without a doubt.
That's neat. Now these are very practical things, as opposed, that's almost an ending note, but I want to go on for a couple of things. I was thinking that many people, when they come to the society, they've had some sort of experience. I mean, that's why they're here. They've had a dream, or a meditative experience, or a flash, or something like that. And they come to us looking for answers, right? And we try to provide, I think, or they look someplace else and someone says, this was the channeled image of this, or this was the fourth initiation happening, or something we try to give a concrete answer. And yet, what you were talking about today comes out of a long historical tradition. There's a lot of philosophy, a lot been written, a lot of people have worked with it. When someone comes in with that initial experience, how can we help them put it in a context that allows them to follow that circle as you described it?
Well, I think if a theosophist is well informed concerning the material present in a certainly very large and extensive theosophical literature, but informed also in a mythic sense concerning these ideas, then you'll probably fairly readily find within the theosophical body of teaching elements which are pertinent to and are capable of amplifying that individual's experience. I don't mean to say that these are analogous situations, but let's say in much Jungian and transpersonal psychotherapy, if somebody comes in with an experience, whatever it happens to be, dream, vision, active imagination, synchronicity, so forth, then it is incumbent upon the therapist or the analyst to find, let's say, existing mythologems, mythic images, and say, look, this is rather like what we find in Egyptian lore, you see, or this is rather like something from the Grail legend. And you kind of watch the person and see which of these makes them sparks.
Yeah.
And then you know that there is something of that order that is taking place. Now, certainly we have a lot of fine mythologems in our theosophical literature that could be used in a similar manner. But if we just interpret them as a kind of school teacherish set of information, if the secret doctrine is not but information, factual information, then of course we can't quite do that with people, because then it won't lend itself to it. Just as an exercise, that all what theosophists could do is first kind of learn a little bit about what myth is supposed to be like, and then take various items of theosophical teaching and say, well, just to have fun this afternoon, let's see what this is like when it's looked upon as a myth, rather than as a series of facts.
So you could take almost any concept.
Almost any concept you could turn into a mythic kind of framework.
Okay.
And it's not only, of course, our idea. Now, Joy Mills has said repeatedly that secret doctrine is a myth and so forth. But the very first thing we have to do is we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that the myth is a lie.
Right.
Because if we do that, then we are going to feel that we are inflicting an indignity upon our cherished theosophical materials when we try to interpret them as something less than fact. Actually, myth is more than fact.
Right.
Myth endures. Facts are really not all that interesting. I can't think of a single fact that I can get terribly excited about. So what, you know, okay. And indeed, we might say the facts that are exciting have a mythic quality.
Yeah, it's because they touch something deep.
Look at a recent fact, the opening up of the Berlin Wall. This has a mythic quality.
Right.
It's not just a wall being torn down. Heck, the walls are being torn down every day by the millions.
And it's not just the wall there. It's the history.
This is it. This has become a symbol of oppression, of division, of dividing a people, of dividing two realities, of a terrible thing. People, it was really the Wailing Wall of Europe. You know, that's what it has become. And now it's being torn down. So it's being torn down inside of us. That is why we get excited. And I've known people who never been to Germany. I've known Jewish people who don't even like the Germans, crying like babies when they saw that on television, because it's a myth. It's not just a fact, it's a myth.
It's like if we were studying basic theosophy and we felt, let's see, if we could get that excitement, if reading something, if studying something in a group gave us that aliveness and that exciting sense, we'd know we'd touched the mythic part of it.
Carl Jung was quite right when he turned objective and subjective sort of around and said that the objective psyche is the deepest psyche. The subjective is outside. This is the subjective reality for the simple reason that you and I see it differently.
Okay.
because of our subjective projections. But
Yeah.
the deeper into the inner reality we move, the more objective things become. And that's really the foundation of the unity of all religions, the unity of symbols, the ultimate convergence, because the closer to the ultimate reality we come, the more objective it is, and then we all see it as one and as the same. Out here, everything is different.
Yeah, for sure.
This is the world of differences.
Yeah. Well, as we're talking, Stephan, about these sort of theosophical facts as myths, perhaps, or mythical archetypal figures, or whatever way you want to talk about it, root race is one of them that kind of fits in with the Atlantis, Lemuria, any of those other kinds of things. How do you see that as a mythic, a mythic truth?
Well, of course, what we are dealing here is the evolutionary or transformational journey, this mandala's movement through the 7 stages of development, which
just like the chakras.
yeah, that's right, which Theosophy outlines in terms of the occult history of the world. And I think this is also very much of a myth. Such as, for instance, the first 2 races in the Hyperborean continent and whatever way back there, they don't even have any bodies. Right. So that can be kind of conceived as the slow coming forth, the slow materialization of our psyche out of the mystery before things become very solid or very concrete. And then we have the so-called Lemurian root race and various features of that. For instance, I think it almost certain it's representing a certain phase of that root race. There were giants with a cyclopean one eye. Right. And this is again that kind of symbolic of the single vision, whereon one doesn't have any differentiation yet. One sees everything one way. William Blake said, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." The Cyclops, the Cyclopean consciousness, which is which does not see the two, only it's a kind of a primitive, undifferentiated oneness. And then we also that's where we kind of enter physicality. And then we come to the Atlantean, which is apparently very much the emotional, the feeling-toned. From the physical and etheric we go to the feeling, the astral. And then the present root race supposedly that we inhabit is very much characterized by the mental and the intuitive. So it's a transformation, it's a metaphor for the growth of consciousness, like the 7 chakras. Now you see, does it really occur in human history? I don't know. But that it does occur within our own psychohistory as individual, this we know. And so there is a mythic element there of considerable magnitude, and once again it could be looked upon in that fashion. But if we insist very much that these things are totally factual, then we run into problems, because we can't even prove that Atlantis ever existed, even less that the Lemuria ever existed. A lot of those theories are based on very antiquated geological and historical concepts which no one, really no educated person is all that excited about anymore nowadays. So if we could look at these more in mythic terms, we would be very much better off.
So as you're talking about this, you're really talking about what was referred to, I can't remember if it was by you or by Jung, as the psycho-pneumatic evolution as opposed to a physical evolution.
Yes, I think that's very important. The evolution a la Darwin was a kind of a big buzzword in HPB's time when the Theosophical philosophy is formulated. Just like nowadays in some circles transformation is a big buzzword. Sure. And so one attaches one's presentation to something that people are aware of and are excited about. But it's quite evident, I think, to anyone who looks at what Theosophy really means by evolution, that it has little to do with the physical, biological evolution that Darwin talks about. Rather, it is a psychoneumatic evolution. It's evolution of psyche, mind, in conjunction with spirit. Pneuma or pneumatic is spiritual, so that we are really dealing with a spiritual transformational process, rather than with evolution pure and simple. I think that we would do ourselves a great service in Theosophy if we kind of cooled it with evolution. First of all, the fundamentalists would be maybe less mad at us, but then they'll probably do that anyway. But generally, really, the evolutionary theory, as I understand it, I'm not a biologist, but at least in certain aspects of it, it is receiving successive blows in science. It's no longer what it was cracked up to be. I think we ought to shift our terminology and our understanding from evolution to transformation a bit more.
Especially since, I remember the first time I ever heard you talk. I think, now we're talking dark ages here, but you drew on the board this sort of theosophical view of evolution from clod to God, a sort of a linear process. I've always remembered that. And the other, which is a more transformative, which is the spiral, the circle, which is really more like what we're talking about today. It doesn't end. You don't finish something. You may go through these things over and over in a transformative way. You don't finish it just once, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also, as I said, the spiral is a repeated circle, and there is our diagram from before that circle, which once we come back to experience again, we repeat it, and it might be envisioned as a spiral, and not just a straight line from here to there, and then it is finished. It's a much more complex and also kind of more aesthetic, more intricate and mysterious kind of a situation, as really all things of the mind and of the soul tend to be.
Then we can always use new terms. We can always use new images. We can switch it around. If we think of it as fact that doesn't change, then evolution is evolution is evolution. We can't let it go. If we're in touch with it as a process, then as Theosophists we can change too. We can use the new images, the new metaphors.
Yes, a mythic view of Theosophy, or of much of it, would, I think, automatically induce a greater degree of flexibility and the ability of Theosophists to move and to change both themselves and in their thinking and in their theories, and yet at the same time not abandon the basic theosophic transmission. Because we then are able to merely reformulate it in new mythologems, yet maintaining the same content. But if we are factual in our orientation, then we are subject to the ravages of time, I think, very, very rapidly.
And if a person wanted to sort of study and follow up on this, what traditions would you say? I mean, there's the Joseph Campbell material is the most recent, but there are other traditions where myth has been explored and done.
Oh yeah, and I wouldn't only say traditions, but there have been great writers within the last 50 years or so who have brought to us a new way of understanding myth. And there are four whom I feel very close to, and of course one of those is our late and great fellow American, Mr. Joseph Campbell. But there are a couple of Germans whose works are translated, and there are Heinrich Zimmer, who has done some very fine things with both medieval mythology and Eastern Indian mythology, the king and the corpse and various others. And then the great Chinese scholar Richard Wilhelm, who brought the I Ching and the whole myth of the I Ching to us in many ways. And then my own countryman, whom I even met as a child, because he was an acquaintance of my father's, Karl Kerényi. who was a great expert in ancient, particularly Greek mythology. And all of these men have taught us to interpret mythology as something that happens within ourselves. The gods, the stories of the gods, the stories of the heroes, the journey of the hero, all of these as being our own story. And that, I think, is a wonderful development. And then, of course, also one of the great people who brought a lot of this into the educational system to some extent and degree in America was Mircea Eliade, late of the University of Chicago, who was Romanian born. So in all of these people we can read their writings, and we can combine these with theosophical material, and we can come up with very, very fine results, I feel.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome, thank you.